All right, so let's dive right in. Today we're tackling some heavy stuff, global conflicts and their impact, on everyone.
Yeah, it's a lot for sure.
It really is. We're zeroing in on two of the biggest ones. Obviously, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, been going on for decades,
Right.
and then the war in Ukraine, which is obviously much more recent.
Right. Yeah.
So I think a lot of people listening, they might think, okay, these conflicts are happening far away. Why should I care?
Sure.
Like, how does it affect me? But it really does, right?
Right. It absolutely does. I think what's fascinating about these two conflicts, even though they're, geographically separated by, quite a bit, the ripple effects are felt globally. I mean, in terms of global stability, economics, I mean, you can even see it in your daily routine, how these things are sort of all intertwined. And it also, leads to a lot of really interesting and complex questions, about, international relations, humanitarian crises, the future of our world,
Yeah.
in a lot of ways.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, okay, let's start with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, this has been going on for what, over 75 years?
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems like completely intractable.
Right.
Like there's, no hope for a solution.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you've been, reading a lot about this.
Right.
What, like at the core, like what is the issue here? Why is this conflict just like so impossible to resolve?
Well, at its core, you have two groups, Israelis and Palestinians, and both are claiming the same land
Right.
as their ancestral homeland.
Right.
And so you have a really deep-seated sense of ownership
Yeah.
and grievance, on both sides. And I think that just makes compromise, incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And, you look at the Oslo Accords, back in the 90s, there was a glimmer of hope there
Right.
that maybe something would come out of that, but ultimately it didn't deliver a lasting peace. And the situation there, I mean, there's frequent clashes, bombings, rocket attacks, military incursions, and all of this is impacting civilians on both sides.
Yeah. And it's really disheartening when you read, about the Oslo Accords. Like, it seems like they were really close,
Right.
but then everything just fell apart. I mean, what are some of the things that have just prevented this lasting peace agreement from happening?
Well, one major obstacle that really gets in the way is the question of borders.
Okay.
Where do you draw the dividing lines between, a potential Israeli state and a Palestinian state?
Yeah.
That's a big sticking point.
Right.
Another contentious issue is the status of Jerusalem.
Right.
Both Israelis and Palestinians consider that city their capital. It's a focal point of religious and political significance
Yeah.
for both groups. And then you have the issue of refugees.
Right.
So Palestinians who were displaced during the 1948 war and their descendants are seeking a right to return.
Yeah.
So, where do they go? What happens to them?
Yeah, and you mentioned Jerusalem, and I was just reading about this, and it just seems like every inch of that land, right? The Temple Mount, which is sacred to both Jews and Muslims. It's just incredible to think about how like every piece of that land is just like imbued with so much history
Absolutely.
and religious meaning. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's not just a political conflict, it's also a clash of narratives and identities and memories
Right.
that are, really rooted in history.
Yeah. Okay. So let's switch gears now. Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. Started with the Russian invasion in 2022. You've been following this very closely. Before we get into like the current situation, can you just give us a little context on like the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, like before the invasion?
Sure. Yeah, it's important to understand that Ukraine and Russia, they have a very long and complex history. They were
Gotcha.
both part of the Soviet Union.
Right.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine, became independent.
Right.
But Russia has never fully accepted Ukraine's sovereignty.
Right.
They've always viewed Ukraine as being within their sphere of influence.
Right.
And back in 2014, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine.
Right.
And that was sort of a precursor, if you will, to the full-scale invasion that we saw in 2022.
Right. And the impact on Ukraine and really the rest of the world has just been massive. I mean, you read about, families being separated and people fleeing their homes and cities being, just reduced to rubble. It's really heartbreaking.
The humanitarian crisis is really staggering. Millions of Ukrainians have been internally displaced.
Yeah.
Or they've become refugees in neighboring countries.
Yeah.
And the war has also, disrupted global supply chains, leading to shortages, price increases for, basic things like food and energy. You've probably seen this at the grocery store
Oh, yeah.
or when you fill up your gas tank.
Yeah, those rising prices are definitely hitting everybody's wallet.
Yeah.
But beyond that, beyond like the economic impact, how has this war kind of reshaped like the geopolitical, I don't know, landscape? What are the like long-term consequences here?
Well, it's really shaken the foundations of the post-Cold War order. We've seen a strengthening of NATO
Right.
with countries like Finland and Sweden joining the alliance.
Right.
That's angered Russia and it's increased tensions.
Right.
There's also, the concern over the potential use of nuclear weapons,
Right.
which, Russia has threatened, although indirectly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's out there,
Right.
And the conflict has also just highlighted, the interconnectedness of the global economy
Yeah.
and how fragile peace really is.
Yeah. So we've talked about these two conflicts, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the war in Ukraine. And they're both incredibly complex. They both just seem so intractable.
Yeah.
I mean, it can feel really overwhelming, to be honest.
Right.
But you've really, helped us understand kind of the nuances and the human cost, of these conflicts.
And I think that's really the first step.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel powerless
Right.
when you're faced with these global conflicts, but awareness, is crucial. And it prompts us to ask, what can we do as individuals, to promote peace
Right.
and understanding, in a world that often seems defined by conflict.
Yeah.
How can we make a difference? And I think that's the question we should all be asking ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a really eye-opening conversation.
My pleasure. It's always good to be here.
Great. Thanks again. And everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Take care.